I pretended to be in a coma at the hospital, and that's when I heard my son whisper, "The money is ours now." Those words cut through me like a blade, even though I was lying there with my eyes closed, machines beeping around me, everyone thinking I was unconscious and dying. But I wasn't dying, I was wide awake, listening to my own son and his wife plan how they were going to spend my fortune before my body was even cold. If you've ever wondered what people really think about you when they believe you can't hear them, if you've ever suspected that the people closest to you might be waiting for you to die so they can cash in, if you've ever had your heart broken by someone you raised and loved unconditionally, settle in and listen close. Because this story's gonna show you that sometimes the most painful truths come when people think you're not listening. And sometimes the best revenge is letting people reveal exactly who they really are. I'm Harold Johnson, 72 years old, been living in Detroit my whole life. Spent 50 years building Johnson Construction from a one-man operation with a pickup truck into one of the most successful minority-owned construction companies in Michigan. We built schools, hospitals, shopping centers, real buildings that mattered, that gave people jobs and pride. My late wife Rebecca and I, we worked side by side for decades. And when she passed 5 years ago from diabetes complications, I thought my son Marcus would step up and help carry on the family legacy. That heart attack hit me like a freight train on a Tuesday morning in October. I was reviewing blueprints for a new community center project when the chest pain started, radiating down my left arm like fire. Next thing I knew, I was in the back of an ambulance, sirens wailing, paramedics working over me while I drifted in and out of consciousness. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was thinking about Rebecca, wondering if I was about to see her again. I woke up 3 days later in the cardiac intensive care unit at Detroit Medical Center. Tubes and wires everywhere, machines monitoring every heartbeat. But here's the thing. I woke up when everyone thought I was still unconscious. The doctor was talking to Marcus and his wife Sandra outside my room, explaining that I was in a medically induced coma while my heart recovered from the massive damage. They thought I couldn't hear anything, couldn't process what was happening around me. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. Instead of letting them know I was awake, I kept my eyes closed and listened. Something in the way Sandra had been acting during my recovery, something in the tone of Marcus's voice when he talked to the doctors, made me want to hear what they really thought was happening. Call it intuition, call it suspicion, but I had a feeling that what I was about to hear would tell me everything I needed to know about my family. And if you're wondering how pretending to be unconscious led to me completely rewriting my will and teaching my greedy family the most expensive lesson of their lives, well, you better hit that subscribe button on Grandpa's Diaries. Because this story's about to show you that sometimes the people who think you're powerless are about to find out just how much power you really have. And sometimes the best way to find out who loves you is to let them think you're not listening. Marcus used to be my pride and joy, the son who was going to carry on everything Rebecca and I had built together. When he was little, he'd come to construction sites with me on weekends, wearing a tiny hard hat that Rebecca had special ordered, asking a million questions about how buildings went up and why we did things certain ways. "Daddy," he'd say, "when I grow up, I'm gonna build the biggest building in Detroit, and I'm gonna put a sign on it that says, Johnson & Johnson Construction." I still remember the day he graduated from Wayne State University Law School, summa cum laude, the first Johnson to ever get a professional degree. Rebecca cried tears of joy in that auditorium, and I was so proud I thought my chest might burst. We'd sacrificed for his education, worked extra jobs to pay for law school, and it felt like all of it was worth it when he walked across that stage in his cap and gown. But somewhere along the way, Marcus changed. Maybe it was law school. Maybe it was the corporate firm where he ended up working. Or maybe it was Sandra, the ambitious woman he married who came from old Detroit money and never let anyone forget it. She had that way about her that rich white women sometimes do, looking at you like you're something interesting but ultimately inferior, like you're a curiosity rather than a person. When Marcus brought Sandra home to meet us, she was polite enough, but I could see her taking inventory of our house, our furniture, our neighborhood. Nothing we had was quite good enough for her standards. Our china wasn't fine enough. Our car wasn't new enough. Our conversation wasn't sophisticated enough. She'd smile and nod, but her eyes were always calculating, always measuring what we were worth versus what she thought we should be worth. The real problem started after Rebecca died. Marcus had been supportive during her illness, visiting regularly, helping with medical decisions, being the son I'd raised him to be. But after the funeral, once the estate was settled and he realized how much money I actually had, between the business, the real estate investments, and the life insurance policies, his attitude shifted dramatically. Suddenly, every conversation became about my retirement plans and whether I was taking care of myself, and whether I'd considered making arrangements for my assets. Marcus would bring Sandra over for dinner, and she'd make comments about how big the house was for just one person, how much work it must be to maintain, how nice it would be if I could simplify my life by moving somewhere smaller and more manageable. They started treating me like I was already halfway to the grave, like I was some fragile old man who couldn't handle his own affairs. Marcus would show up unannounced to check on me, going through my mail, asking about my medical appointments, suggesting that maybe I should consider adding his name to my bank accounts, just in case something happened. Sandra would comment on my driving, my cooking, my ability to manage the stairs in my own house. The most insulting part was how they'd talk about my business like it was already theirs to manage. Marcus would make suggestions about modernizing operations and streamlining the workforce, suggestions that really meant firing the loyal employees who'd worked for me for decades and selling off the equipment to maximize short-term profits. He didn't understand that Johnson Construction wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, a testament to what a black man could build in a city that didn't always believe we could succeed. The changes in Marcus and Sandra's behavior became more obvious in the months leading up to my heart attack. They'd started having what they called family meetings at my house, where they'd sit me down at my own kitchen table and talk about planning for the future, like I was a child who needed guidance rather than the man who'd built everything they were so eager to inherit. During one of these meetings in September, Sandra pulled out a folder of documents she'd prepared. "Harold," she said, using that condescending tone people use when they think they're being helpful, "Marcus and I have been doing some research about estate planning, and we think it's time to get serious about protecting your assets." She spread out brochures for assisted living facilities, information about financial management services, and legal documents that would give Marcus power of attorney over my affairs. "You've worked so hard all your life," she continued, "and you deserve to relax and let other people handle the complicated stuff. Marcus knows the legal side of things, and I have experience with financial planning from my family's business." What she really meant was that they wanted control of my money while I was still alive, wanted to make sure that when I died, the transition would be smooth and profitable for them. They weren't talking about taking care of me. They were talking about taking care of my assets. I listened to their presentation with growing anger and disgust, but I kept my mouth shut because I wanted to see how far they'd push this charade. Marcus talked about consolidating my investments and maximizing efficiency, while Sandra discussed liquidating non-essential properties and creating a more manageable portfolio. They were already spending my money in their heads, already planning how to dismantle everything I'd built. The breaking point came when Sandra suggested that I should sell the construction company to a larger firm that had been making offers for years. "Harold, you're 72 years old," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You don't need the stress of running a business anymore. The offer from Hartwell Development is really generous, and it would give you liquid assets that would be easier for Marcus to manage when the time comes." When the time comes. Not if something happened to me, but when. Like my death was already a foregone conclusion, just a matter of scheduling and paperwork. They weren't planning for my future. They were planning for my funeral, and they wanted to make sure there were no complications when it came time to collect their inheritance. I told them I'd think about their suggestions, but I was already making plans of my own. I called my lawyer and best friend, James Peterson, the next day and asked him to come over for dinner. James had been my attorney for 25 years, had helped me navigate every major business decision, and I trusted him more than anyone else in the world. "James," I said over Rebecca's famous cornbread recipe that I'd finally learned to make myself, I need you to help me with something, and I need you to keep it between us for now. I think my son and his wife are planning to steal everything I've worked for, and I want to be ready for them when they make their move. We spent the next month quietly investigating my options, reviewing my current will, and discussing strategies for protecting my assets from people who saw me as nothing more than a bank account with a pulse. I had a feeling that Marcus and Sandra were going to reveal their true colors soon enough, but I wanted to be prepared when they did. The heart attack gave Marcus and Sandra the opportunity they'd been waiting for. I was unconscious for 3 days, and during that time, they moved fast to position themselves as my medical decision-makers and financial guardians. When I finally woke up but decided to keep pretending I was unconscious, I got to witness exactly what they'd been planning all along. The first conversation I overheard was between Sandra and someone on the phone, probably her mother or one of her friends. She was standing right outside my room in the ICU, talking in what she thought was a whisper, but was actually loud enough for half the floor to hear. "No, he's still unconscious," she was saying. "The doctors think he might not wake up at all, and even if he does, there could be significant brain damage from the lack of oxygen. Marcus is handling all the legal stuff now. We had him declared incompetent yesterday so we can make medical decisions." Incompetent. They'd had me declared incompetent while I was lying there recovering from surgery, unable to defend myself or speak for myself. I'd been unconscious for 3 days, and they'd already started the legal process to take control of my life. "Oh, the business," Sandra continued. "Marcus is meeting with those people from Hartwell Development tomorrow. We figured this would be the perfect time to accept their offer, while Harold can't object to it. The doctors say that even if he recovers, he'll never be able to handle the stress of running a company again. They were selling my life's work while I was lying in a hospital bed, using my medical emergency as an excuse to do everything I'd refused to let them do when I was conscious and able to fight back. These people had been planning this for months, just waiting for the right opportunity to strike. The worst conversation happened on my 4th day in the ICU. Marcus and Sandra were sitting beside my bed, probably thinking I looked peaceful and dying, when Marcus started talking about funeral arrangements. "We should probably start thinking about the service," he said, his voice low but not low enough. "St. Matthew's Episcopal would be appropriate. It's where Mother's family has always gone, and it would send the right message to the business community. Rebecca and I had been members of Mount Olive Baptist Church for 40 years, where we'd gotten married, where Marcus had been baptized, where Rebecca's funeral had been held. But apparently our church wasn't good enough for the kind of funeral Sandra thought would be appropriate for someone with my assets. "What about the will?" Sandra asked, and I felt my blood pressure monitor start beeping faster. "Did James Peterson ever get back to you about the probate timeline?" "That's the beautiful part," Marcus replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Dad never updated his will after Mom died. Everything goes to me directly, no complications, no waiting period. James says we could have access to the liquid assets within 30 days of the death certificate." Then Marcus leaned closer to my bed, so close I could feel his breath on my face, and whispered the words that changed everything between us forever. "The money is ours now, Dad. All those years of listening to your lectures about hard work and building something meaningful. We're finally going to be free to live the kind of life we deserve." I lay there with my eyes closed, machines beeping around me, listening to my son celebrate my impending death like it was a lottery win. This wasn't grief or acceptance or even sadness. This was greed, pure and simple, dressed up in concern and medical necessity. For the next week, I continued my performance as a dying man, while Marcus and Sandra revealed more of their plans. They thought they were being careful, having their most sensitive conversations outside my room or in whispered tones. But hospital acoustics are funny things, and desperate people often talk louder than they realize. I learned that they'd already hired a real estate agent to appraise my house, planning to sell it as soon as the estate cleared probate. "The neighborhood's not really our style," Sandra told someone on the phone. "And honestly, it would be more practical to liquidate everything and start fresh somewhere more appropriate for our income level." They'd contacted Hartwell Development about fast-tracking the sale of Johnson Construction, telling them that I was incapacitated and they needed to move quickly before my condition became public knowledge and affected the company's value. Marcus had apparently convinced them that he had power of attorney and could sign on my behalf. The most heartbreaking part was listening to them discuss my employees, the men and women who'd worked for me for decades, who'd helped build the company from nothing into something we could all be proud of. "We'll have to let most of them go," Marcus told Sandra during one of their planning sessions. "The new owners will want to bring in their own people, and honestly, some of Dad's workers are getting pretty old anyway. It's probably time for them to retire." And these weren't just employees to me, they were family. Tommy Williams had been my first hire 30 years ago, straight out of high school, and I'd watched him grow into one of the best foremen in the city. Maria Santos had started as our bookkeeper when her kids were small, and now she was practically running the office operations. These people had mortgages and families and futures that depended on Johnson Construction continuing to exist. But Marcus and Sandra saw them as nothing more than obstacles to maximizing their profit. During my second week in the hospital, I started planning my response. The doctors were talking about moving me to a regular room soon, which meant I'd need to wake up and start my recovery. But before I did that, I needed to make sure I was ready for the fight that was coming. I used the call button system to signal the nurses when Marcus and Sandra weren't around, pretending to drift in and out of consciousness just long enough to whisper instructions to Nurse Betty, a kind woman who'd been taking care of me since I arrived. I told her I needed to see James Peterson urgently, that it was a matter of life and death, and that she shouldn't tell my family I'd requested the visit. James came that evening after visiting hours, and I filled him in on everything I'd overheard. His face grew darker with each detail, and by the time I finished, he was shaking his head in disgust. "Harold, this is fraud, elder abuse, maybe even attempted theft. We could have them arrested." "No," I said, my voice still weak from the breathing tube they'd removed a few days earlier. "I want to do something better than that. I want to let them think they've won, and then I want to teach them a lesson they'll never forget. Can you help me with that?" James smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Harold, after 40 years of friendship, I think I know exactly what you have in mind, and yes, I can absolutely help you with that." We spent an hour planning my comeback strategy, making sure every detail was perfect, every legal document was ironclad, every surprise was positioned for maximum impact. Marcus and Sandra thought they were playing chess with someone who couldn't move his pieces, but they were about to discover that I'd been playing a completely different game all along. 3 weeks after my heart attack, I made my miraculous recovery. The doctors were amazed at how quickly my brain function returned, how alert and oriented I seemed after such a severe cardiac event. "It's remarkable, Mr. Johnson," Dr. Williams told Marcus and Sandra, who were standing beside my bed looking stunned and slightly disappointed. "Your father's cognitive function appears to be completely intact. He should be able to resume normal activities within a few months." The look on Sandra's face was priceless, like someone had just told her Christmas was canceled. Marcus tried to hide his disappointment better, but I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out how this development affected their timeline for liquidating my assets. "That's wonderful news," Marcus said, but his voice was flat, emotionless. "Dad, how are you feeling? We've been so worried about you." "I'm feeling much better, son," I replied, making my voice sound weaker than it actually was. "Thank you both for taking such good care of everything while I was away." Over the next few days, I let them think I was still fragile, still dependent on their help and guidance. They continued their conversations about selling the business and the house, assuming I was too sick to understand or object to their plans. I played along, nodding weakly when they talked about simplifying my affairs and reducing my stress level. But behind the scenes, James and I were busy. We met with the board of directors at Johnson Construction, explaining what Marcus and Sandra had been planning and putting safeguards in place to prevent any unauthorized sales or transfers. We contacted Hartwell Development and informed them that any negotiations with my son were invalid and potentially criminal. Most importantly, we completely rewrote my will. Instead of leaving everything to Marcus, my new will established the Rebecca Johnson Foundation. a charitable organization dedicated to providing scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in construction and engineering. The foundation would also take over ownership of Johnson Construction, ensuring that my employees kept their jobs and that the company continued to serve the Detroit community. Marcus would inherit exactly $1, along with a letter explaining why. Sandra would get nothing except the satisfaction of knowing that her greed had cost her family millions of dollars. The coup de grace came 6 weeks after my heart attack, when I was supposedly still recovering but actually feeling stronger than I had in years. I invited Marcus and Sandra over for what I told them would be a family meeting to discuss finalizing my affairs. They arrived with folders full of documents, power of attorney papers, property transfer forms, business sale agreements, everything they needed to complete their theft of my life's work. Sandra even brought a bottle of champagne, probably planning to celebrate once they had my signature on all their paperwork. "Dad," Marcus said, settling into his chair at my kitchen table, "Sandra and I have been working really hard to get everything organized for you. We know this has been overwhelming, so we've taken care of all the details. All you need to do is sign a few papers, and you won't have to worry about any of this complicated business stuff anymore." "That's very thoughtful of you both," I said, pulling out a folder of my own. "But before we get to your paperwork, I have something I'd like to share with both of you." I opened my folder and pulled out a copy of my new will, along with transcripts of every conversation I'd overheard, while pretending to be unconscious. Their faces went white as they read, realizing that their elaborate plan had been exposed from the very beginning. "You see," I continued, "the wonderful thing about being in a coma is that people think you can't hear them. They say things they would never say if they thought you were listening. Things like, 'The money is ours now,' and discussions about selling my life's work before my body is even cold." The silence in that kitchen was deafening. Sandra's champagne bottle sat unopened on the table while she stared at the documents that proved they'd been caught red-handed. Marcus kept opening his mouth like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. "What do you say when someone hands you proof that you're exactly as greedy and heartless as you sound?" "Harold," Sandra finally managed, her voice shaking, "you don't understand. We were just trying to help, trying to make sure everything was taken care of in case I died." I finished for her. "Sandra, you were planning my funeral while I was still breathing. You had my business appraised and my house listed before the doctors even knew if I was going to survive. That's not help. That's grave robbing." Marcus tried a different approach. "Dad, maybe we got a little ahead of ourselves, but our hearts were in the right place. We love you, and we were scared of losing you. Can't we work this out?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, and I felt something I'd never felt before. Complete indifference. Not anger, not sadness, just the cold recognition that he was exactly who he'd shown himself to be when he thought I couldn't see him. "Marcus," I said, "I spent 3 weeks listening to you and your wife plan how to spend my money and dismantle everything I built. You never once talked about missing me, or grieving for me, or honoring my memory. You talked about liquidating assets and upgrading your lifestyle and getting rid of employees who've been loyal to this family for decades. The new will stands exactly as James and I wrote it. The Rebecca Johnson Foundation now owns 70% of Johnson Construction, with the remaining 30% going to my employees through a profit-sharing program. My house will become a community center for youth programs. My personal assets will fund scholarships for kids who understand the value of hard work, because they've had to do it themselves. Marcus gets his $1 inheritance, which he hasn't tried to claim. Sandra filed for divorce 6 months later, probably realizing that a man with no inheritance wasn't worth staying married to. The last I heard, Marcus was working at a corporate law firm downtown, making good money but nothing close to the millions he thought he was going to inherit. The irony isn't lost on me that pretending to be unconscious taught me more about consciousness than I'd learned in 72 years of being awake. When you can't react, can't defend yourself, can't influence what people are saying, you get to see them exactly as they are, stripped of all pretense and politeness. I learned that some people love you for who you are, and some people love you for what you have. The trick is figuring out which is which before you make irreversible decisions about trust and inheritance and family loyalty. Johnson Construction is thriving under employee ownership. The Rebecca Johnson Foundation awarded its first scholarships last month to 12 young people who remind me of myself at their age, hungry, determined, and willing to work for what they want instead of waiting for someone else to die and leave it to them. Tell me in the comments, have you ever discovered someone's true feelings about you when they thought you couldn't hear them? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting what you've worked for? Have you ever realized that the people you're trying to take care of are actually trying to take advantage of you? And if this story reminded you that your worth isn't measured by what people think they can get from you, hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. I've got more stories about learning hard truths and making difficult choices, about discovering that sometimes the best thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their worst impulses. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is letting them face the consequences of who they choose to be. I'll see you next week with another cup of coffee and another lesson about the difference between love and greed.